Welcome to We're Not Wizards. We are the best, but not wizards. Enjoy the show!
Welcome to another episode of We're Not Wizards. My name's Richard. I'll be your host for June. We're there. We're like halfway through the year. It's strange. It's weird. It's kind of like the sun is here. It's shining. The grass is being cut on several different occasions. And, it's like the sun's good. You're going outside. You're feeling better about yourself. It's almost like it gets you kind of in the mood to be kind of activated, almost like an activist type kind of style, and you are ready to go out and make changes to the world. But in order to make changes to the future, you've also got to look about the changes that you can make in the present, and you can reflect on that by looking at the changes that have happened in the past, because we've really got to learn about what happened in the past if we're going to educate ourselves about how we can move the way forward. So in an educational way, there's a game I played recently which was about activism that took place in the past, especially around in the good old United States of Americas. And it happened over here. It was the suffrage movement. There was a lady who unfortunately jumped out in front of the king's horse and died. But over in America, it took place over the states and the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So I need somebody here who's going to tell me, if I'm summing it up, it's all about votes for women. And there's only one person I can bring in to talk about votes for women. It's the designer of the game that's come to us from Fort Circle Games, but they are their own independent person. It's Tory Brown. Hello.
Hello. Well, that's quite an introduction. I want to take a walk and change the world all at once.
In the sunny breeze, when it's kind of outside, and it is kind of joyous. I don't know where you're in. Are you in DC?
Yep, Washington, DC.
Don't correct me. Don't give me hints. That's East Coast.
Yes, on the Atlantic.
It's on the Atlantic because Washington State is on the West Coast up the very, very top.
That's the other Washington.
That's where Fraser hangs out. And
that's right, in Seattle.
Nirvana used to hang out. And Pearl Jam used to hang out. But on this side, you've got monuments and buildings and government.
Fugazi and Bad Brains and all of our...
the only reason I know what a Fugazi is because of Wolf of Wall Street with Matthew McConaughey. Going, do you know what a Fugazi is? It's a whizzy, it's a woozy. It's, it's fresh air, It's all about...
You do a very good McConaughey.
I used to do, a long time ago, he also used to do, was it Owen Wilson as well? Wow. And then he got into, he got into Loki. What are you doing?
Could you do this whole interview as Owen Wilson? No, let's not.
No, because that would be terrible. It wouldn't work.
It wouldn't, no.
I'm just, I'm talking here by myself. And, wow. But then you get into almost like Jeff Goldblum. Because you got to have this.
Oh yeah, you go over the ridge,
over the rainbow, more like. So coming full circle, almost into like Fort Circle, because we're drawing all the forts into a circle. There's questions that you can ask a board game designer, okay, and then there's questions that I like to ask before the board game designer became a board game designer. So what I like to say is I like to have a kind of like a look back at the past before we have a little kind of scurry about in the present, and then we kind of launch ourselves off into the suffrage of the future. So my first question to you is, right, on your BGG bio, which obviously I've been researching for weeks and finding all the kinds of snippets of information. I am a very, very good and organized interviewer.
Thorough.
It says thoroughbred. It's like a horse trying to count Up to 4. Clump, clump, clump. You say you're a long-time activist.
Yes.
Do you remember, was there a particular event that changed you from someone who was just standing there kind of looking by and things went on to saying, actually, I want to do something about this. I want to actually actively make a change? Because and not just like go onto social media and go, this is terrible. Have you seen this? Or put up a whole load of GIFs. But actually go out there and kind of start that journey.
So I had the great advantage of not growing up with social media. I am way too old for that ish. And so fortunately, I am an old lady. And so that was great. I think, there was always a bit of awareness of the sort of world. I was one of those nerds who would like watch the news in 2020 as like an elementary, junior high kid. And I had the great fortune, I see it now, of moving around a lot as a kid.
Right.
I lived on the West Coast, close to the Mexican border. I lived in the middle of America in Kansas in a farming town. I lived in the DC suburbs where there was a lot of money and power, and the idea of being able to see as much of America as I did and still see a lot of the problems that we face, the way that inequality worked, the sexism and misogyny, right? That wherever I was, there were these problems, and they took different forms, they looked a little bit different, but that there was still so much we faced together, created this awareness that, something could be done about it. And there's a bit of a naivete that I refuse to let go, that we can do something about it. But I was active in policy debate as a kid. I would dress up in a little suit on weekends with a little briefcase and argue about policy as a child, which is just, what were my parents doing? Like, what were my parents? But the idea that I could argue a position from front and back, against and for, whatever the case might be, all created a lot of this idea in me that there were policy solutions to big problems that we face, and that then through the sort of world of activism, through organizing, that we could do something about it.
Okay. Did you move around because do you have family in the military, or was it just kind of like
it's more
one of these things you just ended up kind of moving about a bit?
Economic instability. I think the life in San Diego, California was really expensive. My family was looking for somewhere with a sort of lower cost of living. My mom had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and was on Social Security disability, and it's just really tough to raise a family in a place like San Diego on public assistance. And so that, right, the sort of insufficiency of public assistance, how hard it was for her to get on it, that created some awareness that like, hey, there's this public policy and it's not working for my family. And then in high school, I ended up moving to live with my dad and stepmom in Northern Virginia for economic opportunity, right? This idea that we are driven to move and to, seek new opportunities. Regardless of borders, is one that I've experienced as a young person, and still respect the folks that are moving across borders and across countries and oceans today.
Yeah. And of course, in the States, people seem to be having to move borders to escape certain kind of stateside laws that are having kind of like a direct effect on their kind of their lives.
If they can. Right. There's like an economic privilege to that. A lot of folks cannot pick up. They have emotional ties. They have all sorts of reasons why they will or will not move. And it should not be incumbent upon people to move to where their rights are respected. In a place like the United States, it should be rights driven, regardless.
Yeah. And opportunity I always find is a funny word because it depends who says it. Because I've heard people kind of defending the most kind of heinous kind of, socioeconomic policies as kind of like everybody should have. They think that the word rights and the word opportunity are kind of interchangeable. So you say that everybody should have. We have the kind of the ruling party. It's like we let the clowns run the circus, but they like to use the word opportunity a lot. So it's not like everybody should have the right to have access to further education. Everybody should have the opportunity to have access to further education, which means it usually comes down to whether or not you've kind of like got an economic kind of foundation kind of underneath to make sure you can kind of have that opportunity, which I'm probably preaching to the converted over there, seeing as you're, you know, in the States, kind of capitalist. Everybody's talking about, well, it's Cyberpunk 2029, which is kind of like a dystopian future. It's like, are you sure? Because we seem to be getting there pretty an awful lot quicker than 2079 or whatever it's gonna set in.
Yeah.
So move it. So then, from a professional basis, because you said you moved to kind of you're with your kind of your dad and your stepmom. So did your kind of initial kind of activism continue, and did that mold itself into the type of career that you were kind of looking to get yourself into?
Yeah, absolutely. I went to school outside of the DC proper, so it was in the sort of suburbs. I went to George Mason University, and there I took a class called Interest Groups Lobbying the Political Process. Right. And I knew about lobbying as like businesses lobbied for things they wanted. Yeah. I hadn't really ever thought about how people could lobby Congress for what they wanted, right? And the idea that citizens can get together, and whether, AARP is the American Association of Retired People, is a really famous lobby for people 60 and up, that there are all sorts of organizations that people come together to then hire a lobbyist or to sort of do citizen activism to get the kind of policy outcomes that they want. So that class really opened my mind on like a career path of the work that I could be doing. But I'd say the sort of most extreme moment of my activism, or awakening, as it were, was the build up to the Iraq War in 2002 and 2003, and the way that the levers of government and the people in power were willing to, shed my classmates' blood, all of this treasure, all of this goodwill and, credibility across the country. While me and other folks like me were marching in the streets screaming like, absolutely not, this is going to turn out terribly. Yeah. And it did, right? Like, not to be like, I was right, but we were right. Yeah. But the sort of activism of like, we didn't get it done, right? The anti-war movement did not get it done in 2002 or 2003. What could we do for the next time that there is a run up to war where the military industrial complex decides that it is going to run amok in order to establish and, pursue its own existence? What could be different? And that has led me to a number of different issues, none of which in the intermediary have been specifically anti-war, but they've certainly been anti-imperial, and they've been in a sort of what I would call a broad-scale progressive lens, be it workers' rights, be it reproductive freedom, be it somebody's environmental movement, that there's all of these issues that are intertwined, and that I've worked on a number of those fronts. And I've been lucky through my career to be able to fight both in the sort of the federal level at Congress and what's happening in Congress and the Senate and the presidential White House, as well as at the state level, where there's not as much energy and there's not as much attention. There certainly isn't as much funding, and how much gets decided, like you were just saying, right? Like rights are now state by state. Being invested in what happens at your state house and at your local political level matters a whole lot more than what those schmucks are doing across the street at Congress, and your voice has much more impact. So seeing all of this happen and play out, and what our ability to change things for the better, to create a more just world, city, state, have been a big part of my career and the work that led me to something like designing a game about a social movement.
In terms of, because is it the case then that if somebody is looking to say, they're looking to kind of improve the overall healthcare for a certain sector, then your job would be to be, well, I know how to bend the ear of the local kind of government, look at the senator for that area, look at the governor for that area, and show you how to kind of approach that and kind of gain some traction with it. Is that the kind of thing that you're kind of doing?
It's a great way to put it. I think it's the idea of, how are we telling a story about healthcare in a certain sector? So I do messaging and communications work. Right. And so it isn't even necessarily as much about like who, right? I could do the work on where's this policy created? How do we move mechanisms? What gets us a vote count up to? But my specialty has become about narrative and message, about what story do we want to tell? How do we create effective arguments for the people that are making the decisions, be it, a city council, state, maybe it's bureaucracy, and the sort of way then we tell that story to the public, to our audience, to folks that we need to move along and to bring with us. So it's really about storytelling and about effective communication as much as it is about lobbying and the research and the sort of grassroots organizing and all these other pieces that are important part of it, right? It all becomes part of a team to get something done.
Okay. And so because over here, right, because one of the things that we don't understand an awful lot is because America's got like the federal level government, which is kind of like the overall rule saying like, okay, you're not allowed to kill people, kind of thing. Whereas the state, the individual states make up their own laws. So basically that's why, am I right in saying, is that why in relation to kind of like healthcare rights for women and kind of like trans rights and stuff at the moment is, even though the federal government can put down a line and say, right, everybody's going to get, the latest one was, I don't know if you heard about the tweet about one of the major providers of insulin in the States. They didn't get their account hijacked, but somebody basically, when Elon Musk rolled out the verified account, somebody pretended to be this insulin provider and basically said,
Eli Lilly,
and basically says the insulin is going to be free. And then they ended up losing like billions off their stock price because everybody kind of went
temporarily,
for a little bit before they rallied it up. But then they said they were going to bring in kind of like a cap on insulin, and it appears that while that seems to be getting rolled out, there's like states that are red, a lot of red states are actually voting against having this insulin cap. And I don't know if that's because who they're funded. I think it was that Robin Williams said that politicians should wear kind of like overalls, like not like the NASCAR guys do, so you can see who's actually kind of sponsoring them. So there's that. So that kind of thing kind of.
So, I mean, the interplay between federal, state, and local governments is complicated. There is sort of cross jurisdiction. There is purely, right, sort of, and the Constitution is essentially supposed to limit what the federal government can do, and sort of everything else gets enumerated to the states. And as we've developed and grown as a society and like the future happens and technology emerges, those things aren't sort of hard and fast, although you still have the Supreme Court that will, I think, rule or will interpret some of these clauses. Is the federal government's jurisdiction? Is this state? That kind of a thing. Now, when you said, right, the federal government says you can't murder anyone, actually, that's state. It's a state law. If you murder someone, you are going to be charged and go to a state prison rather than a federal prison. So you can't, if you murder someone on a military base or in a national park, you could go to federal prison, right? Because that's their jurisdiction. But if you do it, even if you murder someone in your city, chances are you're going to go to a state penitentiary if you are found guilty of that. So even that's not hard and fast, right? And it is important, I think, to understand how much state governments do and how much they have jurisdiction and how they can fill in the gaps or create bigger gaps from what the federal government has decided. People are constantly obsessed with what's happening in the Senate.
Yes.
Nothing, right? Nothing is happening. And they just don't pay much attention to, except for when stuff is really terrible, like in Florida and some of these other states, just how much power our state level governments have. And some of these state representative districts have a few thousand members. You could, like, you and all of your neighbors could show up and really make a difference, where it would be very difficult to do that same kind of thing in Congress and impossible in the Senate. The power we have, because the numbers of, it's such a small number of constituents that each state senator or state rep has. Nebraska's unicameral, so they only have one House level, but everybody else has two. That they have, that you have so much more impact when you focus on what's happening at the state level and what's happening with your healthcare, what's happening in the environment, what's happening to local abortion clinics and your right to choose. All of these are happening at the state level. And the federal government is just supposed to provide a really basic sort of, bottom line tier, and everything above and on top of that, you can go to your state government and ask for better, more gooder, and, with the right kind of lobbying strategy and the right activism tools, maybe make that possible. But what you're going to argue to the people in the state of Florida that have their own interests in whoever it is on their little jumpsuit with their logos is you're going to make different arguments in Washington state, right? Where Fraser and all of his friends hang out. And that was part of what the suffragists had to figure out, right? They were trying to decide and go between a state level strategy, state by state, versus a federal strategy. And part of that gets played out in the game as well.
And that's a nice kind of segue back into what we should be talking about, which is a board game.
No, we can talk about this forever, please.
No, but that's the whole point. Is like that is the whole point. I mean, if you want to listen to a podcast, I've always been interested in the person behind the game. And that's always been the kind of the to and fro with my podcast is, and the reason that this thing exists was because, yes, I can ask you about kind of like the game. And then you could go on another podcast and they would ask you about the game. But this opens up a whole pile of different kind of questions and kind of ways forward and things like that. Because the way I see like a board game usually getting designed, is that somebody will sit down with various pieces of paper and they will come up with a kind of like a good mechanic. And then, like a good song, right, they'll have a tune, and then they'll think about the lyrics and the theme on top of that, yeah? But I was wondering, were you, instead of sitting with several pieces of paper and several pieces of mechanics, were you thinking about, I have a potential idea for a board game, but were you then thinking about different themes that you could kind of bring over? Because it sounds to me that you're kind of like when you're putting a point across, you're like trying to educate the person at the same time. It's not the case that you're just saying, look, I'm right and this is why we should do it. It's like, here's all the reasons why we should be approaching it in this level. Because you said that, you've been doing a lot of kind of like information and almost like education through that information, kind of giving people the facts, but in a digestible format that they can then move forward with. So with the likes of like, what made you decide, well, first of all, what made you decide to go into kind of like the board game kind of design space? And secondly, I guess what made you decide, out of all of the topics, which I'm pretty sure you could create a game out of, what made you decide that it was kind of like the women's suffrage kind of idea that you would run with?
Sure. So my story is unique. I know my publisher, Kevin Bertram from Fort Circle Games, who I don't know who would ever have him on a podcast, but it's like,
some damn fool would have him on a podcast in a bit.
Stay tuned to We Are Not Wizards. So I know Kevin going back to college. Right. Like I met him my freshman year of college and we stayed in touch. I worked for him for a little while in a company that he had, and he eventually got around to this, like, he's like, I'm going to make board games. I'm like, okay, Kevin, sure. Whatever you say, right? Like,
put your hand on his shoulder and pat him on the shoulder and go, "That's okay, Kevin. There you go. Yeah, you will. You just keep dreaming." That
sounds fun. Yeah. And then he did. Wow. He made Shores of Tripoli. Yeah. It did really well. He created this sort of community around the game of folks that had play tested and got these great reviews. And he said to a bunch of our friends, "What's the next game I should do?" Yeah. Right. And so, I think we kicked around some different ideas. Like you were saying, there's so much grist in topics, especially if you're not just looking at wars between 1860 and 1947. If you expand beyond that, there's just a ton of stuff. And I read an article in 2019 that in 2020, the U.S. would be celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And I knew about women's suffrage and some of the push. I was a women's studies minor in college. And so I had a sort of real, basic understanding of the narrative. And I said to Kevin, like, hey, like next year is the centennial. It's going to be this like great moment where people are talking about it. Here's a way to tell the story in a different format. And I think it would make for a really interesting board game. The back and forth, the divisions, like the stuff that I knew just felt to me like good board game stuff. And instead of him saying, great idea, like I'll talk to you when the board game is done, he said, great idea, go do it. And it was not what I expected. was a pretty light game. Right, I had copies of Ticket to Ride and Carcassonne. I grew up as a Trivial Pursuit kid, which says more about me than it does about Trivial Pursuit. And then I got, right at the beginning of the pandemic, a copy of Watergate.
Yeah.
And Watergate really opened my mind on political narrative storytelling through board game, and this sort of two-sided game with the sort of card-driven aspect, right? Like, it all starts to sort of come into place. And so I'm telling Kevin, like, that suffrage idea that I had while I'm playing Watergate, and it's really interesting, and I think there's something there. And he said, well, what you need to play is 1960, The Making of a President. And the idea that you could play as campaign manager, and you would have all these different tracks, and that you're like playing out of the Electoral College, like, it all is just sort of like starting to fall into place in my mind. And so I started researching content in, I guess, like May of 2020, which had some advantages for me. I was unemployed, so I just had a ton of time. I was recently sober. I'd gone through recovery, so I had a ton of energy and somewhere I needed to put that energy. And it was the global pandemic, so I couldn't go out and do anything else. So these like magical factors combined, I, start playing these games a lot and thinking through them. I'm able to, Zoom and eventually meet with Kevin to talk through different ideas and mechanics. I had Shores of Tripoli as well. And so that really creates the foundation, right? So we've got this map, we've got these two decks of cards. Like, unlike 1960, I think like my research is very much built around support and oppose. And it never even occurs to me that someone might not want to play opposition to suffrage. I learned through playtesting and through initial reaction that people have big feelings about playing the oppose side. But like, you play Nixon, you play Nazis, you play Confederates, like, what's the big whoop? But big whoop.
It's kind of like, I don't know. It's kind of like, even if you play as kind of like the Nazis, you know that they're kind of going to get defeated. And there's a kind of I think it's kind of like, it's a bit close. I think it's at the moment, it's a bit close to the bone. When people are saying like, kind of like, we're looking at kind of like the women's rights to vote. And they're like, in the last 2 years, like in some cases, a lot of women's healthcare services have been kind of decimated. I think kind of like you sitting there and chuckling and going, try and vote this out. It's like if you had like a top hat and a kind of twiddly moustache and a cape, I think you would be fine. But I think it was kind of noticeable. What I noticed in the game is that when you're playing kind of like the solo mode, you can't kind of play as the guys. You can't kind of sit there and go, right, that's it, I'm stopping you from voting, stopping you from voting, stopping you from voting. You kind of did that. And that was an actual kind of direct result of people, you said the play testing, people just didn't want to play as kind of like the incumbents, I guess. Yep.
So then came the Oppobot. And I think like Fort Circle and Kevin really believe in solitaire mode. Yeah. I think Kevin plays a lot of games alone. And so he and his wife play a ton of games.
I'm keeping that. He's gonna listen. He's gonna listen to this, right? And then he's gonna. So. Kevin's coming on the show friends. Potentially, and like he's potentially going to be confirmed. He's definitely coming on in around about a week's time. So by that time, depending on how quickly I get this edited, Kevin is going to have a right to. We're going to have Kevin Responds section in that podcast where you can respond to everything that you say. So,
all right. Well, let me utilize my time and space here while I still have it.
It's fine. I mean, I'd say you just get it out your system. You just say how you feel. Kevin, you lonely solo playing man. But
so the solo mode was really important as a publisher and what the market demands. But that created the sort of existence or the possibility of co-op mode, which I think has been an incredibly important piece of the game. That if I think opposition is important. I think understanding backlash to social movements is critical. Yeah. A lot of people tell me they never thought about how women opposed the right to vote. And so creating a deck where you get to see some of these women saying they don't want the right to vote for any other women, and the way that industry, I think there's a lot to learn, but you're right. It's not like playing a Nazi with like an air raid run, right? Like it is the xenophobia card, and it is the removing of power and the like preventing of rights. And it feels, it very tied to oppression, right? Like you're playing oppression essentially. Whereas in a Confederacy game, maybe not so much.
But also I think as a kid, I mean, when I was a kid growing up, you would play, you would go around playing kind of like, we're going to be the British Army. You're going to be like, you're going to be like the Nazis or the German army or whatever. You'd have toy soldiers. You it's like not like my dad says, here you go, son, you can play this. And he says, what is it? It's like, well, on here it's got the British government and you've got the Pankhursts on the other side. So you can play. And it's not like, maybe if they both had guns, then that would be kind of like
a fair fight.
It'd be an interesting kind of thing. But I mean, it's kind of strange because, well, it's not kind of strange, but the game, the core game is it's a 2-player game. I mean, just like Shores of Tripoli, and I've played Shores of Tripoli as well, and it was kind of interesting how similar they were in kind of like base mechanics, but ironically, and Kevin's gonna either like this or not like this next statement, but I don't care, Kevin. You get your chance.
There's no stakes, right? It doesn't feel like there are stakes in that game.
It's almost like Votes for Women is kind of like acts more like a war game than the Shores of Tripoli did. If you know what I mean.
Play that for him.
And I'll tell you why. Okay, because in the Shores of Tripoli, you're not kind of getting the back. I said this in the review. You're not kind of getting the back and forward of what you would consider like consider a normal war game. What I'm saying is in Shores of Tripoli, it's almost like, and he'll when I'm speaking to him, we can chat about this anyway. But in Shores of Tripoli, it feels like you're kind of like on a roller coaster. And you're deciding whether or not when you're opening and closing your eyes and when you're putting your hands in the air. But the general kind of destination is always kind of like the same. There's certain parts within the game that things escalate. There's different armies that are brought on. There's an entire bigger mechanic that's kind of brought on. Whereas for Votes for Women, you do feel there's a general kind of ebb and flow. And as you get further and further into the rounds of the game, and the event cards, the bigger event cards that come out in the later acts really kind of do, they really kind of sway things kind of back and forward. Yep. And the fact you've got the little ticks and crosses, which is cool. I really like that. You kind of get more of that kind of back and forward with kind of like a war game-ish kind of thing. I don't know if that makes sense. It made sense in my head.
Oh, it makes it, to me, the game uses the language of war game to tell a story about this nonviolent political struggle, right? Now, does that make it a war game is a question people have big feelings about. And one that I don't know if I really care. I mean, I think that this, like, some war gamers have been super supportive, embracing, they see it, it makes sense, they feel it. Other people, not so much. And that it is a theme not worthy of the language. That hurts my feelings and is, I think, kind of not nice. But I think that, it's interesting. I think it creates more questions about war games and the war game community than it does answer anything about Votes for Women. Votes for Women exists. It's out there. People that aren't war gamers really like it. People that are war gamers really like it. I guess it's like, to me, this like, what is a war game? What isn't a war game? It's been going on before Votes for Women. It'll keep going on. And they're just projecting their struggles about identity and about the sort of in-group and what counts onto my game in this moment, and they'll soon lose interest and move on to the next one that they don't think counts, and sort of defining their identity through exclusion. I think it's like not how I want to live my life and my values about inclusion. But, you know, these awards, I kind of make a difference, right? People look at these awards list and decide whether to buy a game or not, you know, and so there is some promotional value in being considered a good war game. Although I've had a conversation, I think I was talking somebody recently about like, if I'm trying to help expand wargaming, which I am, right? That more people find it approachable and can like learn some basic mechanics that then would go into some of the heavier themes. You know, do I want to be tied as a war game and cast and mold it and, you know, get that brand? Or can it be like, oh, hey, you like Votes for Women? You might like Twilight Struggle.
Yeah.
And not have to be tied to that label. So I try to stay out of it, but I think sometimes people are mean and I don't like that.
The irony is, this is me doing an Alanis Morissette. The irony is, like, probably
It's not really ironic.
It's not ironic. It's just a pain in the ass. Is that my opening paragraph to my review on Shores of Tripoli was that this game talks about the political. It's something to do with the political campaign of the American Merchant Navy Force or whatever, trying to prevent the piracy of the Tripolitan Empire. Some of you people might not be interested in kind of games involving politics, so I'm just warning you now. And it was kind of like, you know, because I knew obviously the kind of the Votes for Women kind of, I don't know, in your experience, has there been a lot of people who have said, I'm not going to play this game because it's about a historical event that took place 100 years ago, as they run off to play kind of Undaunted instead?
Not to my face, which is something that's been interesting about this experience, is that I see blog posts about the chatter. I don't necessarily see the chatter. I think this is a conversation about, like, you know, a game about women stuff sucks. And I think those, like, if that, I hear that those conversations are happening. I don't see them. I think it's in Discord channels. I think it's in Facebook groups. I think it's in closed environments where it feels safe to say girls drool and boys war rules or whatever it might be. You know, and I think I see people that are like, you know, the game got written up on IGN.com, which primarily a video game and sort of attracts that kind of type, you know, or a certain type of a certain type. Because lots of people in video games aren't weird.
Friend of the show, Matt Thrower, that wrote the review. We had a discussion about and he sent me the link to the review. And
did you read the comments?
It's like that gif where you see the person kind of zipping up in the hazmat suit and then going, right, I'm about to go. Yeah. And it's kind of like,
great.
I'd like to say I was really surprised, but I kind of wasn't surprised by the number of people who had kind of like generic avatars and no bravery to see who they were. It was, you know, it's kind of, I walked in there exactly what I expected, and it you know, it didn't disappoint. Except I
think it was a little more than I expected, but still understood. Like, this is a product of promotion, right? That my game was reviewed, that Matt reviewed it on IGN is worth so much more. There's so many more people that will read the review and think about buying the game than will go down into the comment section and be convinced, oh, it's a game about history and we don't like that, right? Like, who cares about women's history? This is a dumb idea for a game. Yeah. There have been some comments on the Board Game Geek, right? Like some 1 ratings. There's been some that, and again, right? Like, if you're gonna get over 100 reviews on 200, I don't know, whatever we're at now, like, you're gonna get, right? It's a product of the success, and I would not trade the success for avoiding these people.
I think I think the thing with, and even like everybody talks about the BGG review system, saying that I know some people that, you know, they just go in and that's what they do. They mark a game as a 1, regardless if they've played it or not. I've heard people talking about marking games as a 1 that they're interested in, so that they can go back in and they can look at those games again, because they filter them by the fact that they've got 1 star. Because you can go in and...
What kind of maniac? You can do a 5! What?
Yeah. But I mean, it's just like some people kind of have their kind of their systems. I think what's surprising about Votes for Women, and the people that I know that have played it, have been very surprised by the level of complexity that's involved in the game. Because I have played games that have a kind of a that one of the aims, because when I'm reviewing games, I look at the aim of the game. Yeah. So there's games that I have played which, you know, the theme is based around kind of history and education, and try to teach people about maybe a subject that they're just not aware of. And sometimes you walk away from those games going, right, the point of this game isn't to sit down and go, whew, that was a game. It's to for them to sit down and then have a pile of kind of reference materials that leads to almost like a classroom environment. I've played a couple of games like that now, where if you take it as a game, you're kind of like, it's fine. You know, it's a game. It's okay. I'm going to play it a couple more times. There's certain people I want to play with it, but I'm not going to kind of rush. It's not going to make any of my top 10 lists. But the surprising thing about Votes for Women was there was a lot of crunch in there. There was a lot of game in there. There was a lot of strategy in there. And when I played it, I remember playing it for the first time and just, you know, looking at the person I was playing with and just going, there's a lot more here than I was expecting. I'm not,
what,
you know,
what set those expectations? Because it's a historical game, there were not expectations because of educational games?
Yeah, I think it was a bit of both, because I've played quite a few kind of educational games that have been less kind of crunchy, that haven't been kind of labeled, this is a combat game. And I went in kind of going, I didn't expect it to be as kind of in your face, kind of two sides directly opposing each other, and the struggle kind of back and forward and the different tactics that you had. And it was very much a kind of there's a lot of avoidance for kind of like, a lot of games end up kind of being cooperative. You can't really do a kind of a kick people's ass. You can't kind of have people kind of fighting back. Everybody's kind of wanting to be happy and friendly. But this was a game where you're kind of like, you're playing cards and you're going like, right, I'm just putting, you know, I'm just adding, I'm just adding people here, 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 and here. And that means I'm flipping this one, this one, this one, and this one. So it was quite vicious, which kind of took me by surprise, I think, on how crunchy it was.
I mean, the history is contentious, right? Like, I think that drives from the true and accurate reading of the history, that, you know, there is no compromise. I mean, there's compromise in suffrage, and that's only the white women get to vote, and that is insufficient, right? Yeah. Like, we do not like that, right? At this point, we understand that it's women vote or they don't, and they aren't people, and they aren't considered, persons under, or citizens in our, right? And there was a lot of losing in the suffrage movement that I don't think people necessarily give the suffragists a lot of, credit for. That, like, it was not just like, we want the vote. Okay, sure, here you go, right? Like, it was like time and like failed campaign and this state and then this state again. And right, there was just like all of this. And then there was like these divisions and they were tearing each other apart. And then they were kind of coming back together because they were realizing they couldn't get anything done alone. So like all the history is so good. The story the real, like, full story is so fraught and dynamic, and, you know, that it comes through, like, the gameplay, I hope, does sort of, gives its due to the history rather than the history trying to, like, create gameplay. That makes it, you know, like, I wanted the game to feel tense because it did feel tense, and they didn't know, the suffragists didn't know that they were necessarily going to be successful once the amendment passed the Congress. You know, final roll has been a little bit controversial in reviews, that, like, that's how it comes down, is just rolling of dice, and that's just luck and chance, right? Well, like, yeah, the suffragists got lucky. They didn't think they were going to win Tennessee. They weren't sure about where they were going to go next. Like, there was maybe 6 or 8 states, I think, left to vote at that moment. So there was still a lot of ground left to fight over, and not hospitable. And so, you know, and again, right, like, the history drove those themes, those divisions, those, right, like, what's happening in the Senate, where we're in Congress, where we're gaining ground and losing it, and gaining, like, it's all, like, thanks to the real lived experience.
And is that what drove you to kind of put as much flavor text as you did in the cards? Because, again, this is something else that I experienced, was that you're sitting there kind of like, normally, I guess it was the same with Shores of Tripoli as well, is that you're sitting there with your hand of cards, and for people that haven't played the game, as you play through the game, basically the kind of the event cards that you play kind of get more and more extreme, which kind of like at the beginning, it's like, maybe says, okay, if you add an extra campaigner to this state in this territory, whereas when you get to the end, it's kind of like pretty much extreme, flip all these. If you've got one thing here, you can add 4 here and stuff like that. But that was reflecting kind of like, I found it intriguing that it kind of reflected as things were kind of getting to the line, and they were getting to this conclusion whether either suffrage was going to happen or it wasn't, that there was kind of more extremes on kind of both sides. More, the action was really ramped up, and the kind of the desperation to kind of quell it kind of ramped up, and you can see that on the flavor text on the card, which meant I was sitting there reading that going, oh okay, because it in here, when I was in higher history, we learned about the suffrage movement in the UK, and it came down to, there was a lot of kind of upper class English women who wanted to vote. Women did a lot of work during the First World War, and at the end of the First World War, because they were good old girls, we allowed them to vote. And that's kind of like, and then you get told about the lady that jumped in front of the king's horse and got killed. And that's kind of about it. It's kind of, they don't go into kind of back and forth. I guess you can go in and you can study the subject like anything else, but it's like, this is a thing that's happened, and it was great, well done, kind of thing.
And there wasn't much opposition, right? They just had to, like, yell loud enough, and then, or I guess with upper class ladies, they would, like, I don't know, right, wear a ribbon,
the sash ribbons,
the sash
thing across their chest, they had to wear that, and that's how they got the vote, yeah.
In the United States, the narrative was set by a few suffragists because they wrote a 7-volume book called The History of the Woman Suffrage Movement. They really understood the value of history is written by the victors. They had not won, and they decided to name themselves victors, originators, and the full, right, they were the ones that did it. They invited, and it was anyone that you might name, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, this woman, Matilda Gage, they wrote this book and decided that was the history of it. There was a woman named Lucy Stone who was invited to share some of her papers and materials and that, her contributions. And she said, no, history will decide. And no one knows who Lucy Stone is, right? Because that's not actually how history isn't a person,
No.
right? Like people create history and decide who we focus on, how we tell these stories. So the flavor text became a way for me to write almost a textbook in text message form, right? Because it's 160 characters on the bottom of these cards. That, what was missing from some of these major narratives, or what we tell people at Women's History Month, right? When we get all the 31 days to be women's history experts, that the flavor text became a way to sort of tell a little bit more of the story, and creating the cards themselves, making sure that women of color were included, making sure that industries who opposed were mentioned, making sure that natural disasters and how they affect, right, that there's all of this stuff going on, in the way that race and class and, what was happening in the South all factor in, let me tell more of what we've researched and discovered and put together since the history of women's suffrage was published in the 1910s, and, gives, not a counter narrative, but a fuller narrative and a more accurate one, based on, sort of where research and sort of popular understanding is now.
Is that why you decided to put in a lot of the kind of the supporting documents in the box as well? Just like Shores of Tripoli had like kind of letters, and it also had a whole section, and he actually had a whole section which was, here's a design document on why we went. It was almost like there was apologies from Kevin to say, oh, we didn't put this ship in, I know that they were working with this ship. It was almost like he was preempting the kind of the history buffs coming in and going, I think you'll actually find it was a 3-mast frigate. But when you open up the box for Votes for Women, there's so many kind of different documents. And was that something that it was a conscious decision from the beginning, that you sat down and said, look, if this is going out there, and if we're taking this out there, then I want these to go in every single box, because I know the game's really, really good, but I also want to make sure that there's kind of some educational and material involved in that. So if people, it can be like a stepping stone to people learning more about the movement before going off and kind of discovering other stuff themselves.
The historical documents do a couple of amazing things. One is that they let the sources speak for themselves. It is not my interpretation or just like a snippet of a quote on a flavor text. It is the telegram that Anna Shaw Howard wrote to Alice Paul before the 1913 procession. It is the letter that, the head of the Standard Guano Company wrote about, if you let Emmeline Pankhurst in the United States, I'll never vote Democratic again. Yeah. Right. It is all right. It lets these people, it also lets us, it refers back to a bunch of the cards, right? So, Maria de Lopez is a card, active in California and on the West Coast in the 1913 campaign. But it also, she translated or wrote the Spanish language flyer that's included in the box. It also gives me a range. We include a letter from Abigail Adams to her husband, telling him to remember the ladies during the Constitutional Convention, and it includes the voter registration slip that the mom of the deciding vote in Tennessee, who was able to convince him to vote, right, her voter registration card. Yeah. It gives us so this range of, centuries. This gives us a range of, the sample ballot that suffragists passed out in Chicago when they were trying to vote for women's suffrage and teaching people how to vote for suffrage. So it is a way that people immerse into the history of the cards, that the cards themselves are just kind of too small and too busy to do. We worked with a professor of women's history to identify some of these documents and figure out what would go in. And I think Kevin was narrow it down to 3. And I gave him 15, and we compromised on 13. And he will say now that he was always in favor of it, and that he blames it on his wife or something. But it is something so special and something that so many people remark about when they see the game. Yeah. It sets it apart. It becomes a museum in a box. The designer's notes has a description and a timeline of each of these documents. So it's not just what the heck is this?
Yeah.
You can actually read through and answer for yourself, and then dive deeper into whatever you want to learn more about.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting because I must admit I have played several board games now in my time, and I don't remember, even in the ones that have, are based around historical events, go into as much detail to say they kind of expect almost like a knowledge before you kind of go in, whereas you're kind of saying, well, I expect you probably maybe aren't kind of aware of this. But the letters and that, the historical documents aside, one of the things that several people that I've spoken to and I noticed was that the graphical design and the general artistic design direction of the game is striking. I mean, you literally have the red crosses and the red crosses and the green ticks. You have like these kind of like pillars for the Senate and stuff like that. Was that something that you were involved in?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So we would call it green check marks and red X's, right? But that's a ballot, right? I vote on an electronic machine here in Washington, and like that's to me says election, and it says voting and enfranchisement. So working with Panda to create those wooden pieces, and I think we went through a couple of different designs because they were like too brittle, and so we just had to alternate that kind of a thing. And the meeples as well were the same thing, right? There are like suffragist meeples, and there are like angry dude raised fist meeples in opposition. The congressional columns I love deeply. It all like that kind of very clear. It says so much, these small little pieces. I love them. And because Kevin is a good publisher, we include extras of each because things break and like pieces get lost. And I think that kind of like balance on attention to the history and attention to the product is part of what, is this sort of like magic calculus that came together for Votes for Women. The design was driven by Bridget Delicato, who is a remarkable graphic designer who created the iconography of the cards and the layout and the sort of, there's a very like scrapbook pastiche that she created out of all of those cards and the reverse of the cards as well. Incredibly talented, has done a number of other board games design and was just responsive and like smart and would say like, that's not gonna work. And I'm like, but I like this picture. Pick a new, right? Like, and so having a graphic designer that is so talented was also just sort of like the stars aligning to bring it all together.
Yeah, because when it sits on the table, I mean, it's like we mentioned kind of like Twilight Struggle, even like Watergate and stuff like that. When it's out on the table, it's like, it kind of draws your eye. It does, when you're kind of mid-game, or even towards the end, you can actually, again, it helps to build up the tension as a game. Because if you're, regardless of what side you're on, all you can see is like ticks and crosses kind of getting put down. And normally in these types of games, you usually don't know the end result until everybody's it reaches a point in the game where everything stops and then you kind of decide. Whereas it's like, you could tell straight away by looking at it going, oh my goodness, they're going to take that state and then I have to take this state and then they have to take this area and that means they've got this. And you could see it kind of straight away. And that was kind of like, it added to kind of like the overall tension and it kind of really, really kind of ramped it up. And that was regardless of no matter how many times you kind of played it, you kind of didn't get used to kind of going, oh yeah, this is really going to build up. You're kind of like going, oh no, they've just, and it was kind of like going from there.
Well, the game is asymmetrical, right? And so it's hard to necessarily know that you've got 36 to 13 states, right? Like you can feel like you've got 25 states and you're doing good, but you still need those 11 more. And so it really helps to be able to visualize in that sort of final voting mechanism, or once you've passed through Congress, to place the ticks out really gives a better visual of where you are, but it's still not clear because you have to have such an overwhelming majority of support on suffrage side.
I guess, where'd you go next then? I mean, is this have you already kind of started to get kind of emails from Kevin saying, so, right, we've done this because, and this is a strange thing, Votes for Women over here isn't as readily available as it is in the US.
Yeah. Oh, I hear about it. Those Australians are super mad about the shipping situation. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
But are you already thinking about the next game? Have you got a couple of different ideas? I mean, because the option could be, well, we could take just a different topic and we could do something similar. Or are you thinking, well, I'm going to challenge myself and go for a kind of a slightly different design on the next game?
Yeah, so I've just recently started to seriously entertain the idea of a next one. The launch has been overwhelming. I've been really lucky and grateful to be able to talk to lots of people like you, not as funny, but like you and other, sort of podcasts. And so I've just had a lot to do with the launch for Votes for Women. But, what's next has been a natural question in a lot of these conversations. Some folks immediately were like, oh, a 19th Amendment game, you should do the Equal Rights Amendment, which was proposed but never ratified. And, it would put a new amendment into the American Constitution that says, you cannot be sexist or something like that. Right. That would be the sort of like phase 2, Votes for Women 2 Electric Boogaloo, right? That would be the next, but that doesn't have as much appeal to me. I'm not convinced of the political strategy behind it. And so to devote a bunch of time and energy on trying to quantify a popular strategy in order to gamify that just hasn't been as interesting. What I am committed to is this idea of movement games. There are a lot of really interesting games happening in the space. I think of Taylor Schuss and Stonewall Uprising, right? I think of, even Alex Knight's Land and Freedom game about the movements of the Spanish Civil War and how they worked together or didn't, sort of depending on your cooperative level. So American movements that can remind us of where we've gone and where we can go. I think there's some interesting sort of ground to look at in the environmental movement, because they've had this big question of, how does industry interact with the environmental, right? And as wind and solar come online and we see these alternative forms of energy, is that creating the kind of popular will we need to actually tackle the big challenges in front of us? I think nuclear is an interesting sort of wild card in there. I work now in the labor movement, and the American labor movement is full of really fascinating people and sacrifice and, there's a lot of need, and we're in this moment of resurgent interest in labor unions as service workers at Starbucks and some of these other, retail locations are starting to unionize, and, and so that there's ideas sort of floating around, but I don't see how I could make a zombie game.
I was just about to say that. It's for the next one, it'd be like, and here we have big, giant electric boogaloo robots, the fighting game, and it's from the maker of Votes for Women, and you just go like that.
Comes color splotch, right? And some of those are now at this point, a walk in the park, a national park, a right? These nature these nature games are super popular. I mean, wonderfully done, right? That's just become what I see as a huge piece of the market. And it's interesting, and those games are beautiful and they're nice, right? But this notion that we can tell stories and bring people into movements and help some of these bigger, my life is dedicated to causes bigger than myself, right? And so could I give that up for a game? And could I spend all of the time and heartbreak and tears and blood and everything on something that's nice but doesn't do what I in my heart know I am here on this earth to do, which is to bring people together to get big things done on behalf of all of us. I don't think I've got, so what's a story, something as evocative and as engaging and as interesting as the suffrage movement that I can sort of, I think the mechanics are going to be much different, right? It can't be a constitutional amendment game. I don't think a temperance movement game and prohibition sells. I think the gaming community just loves their beer too much, and that's fine. but what tells a story about moving us forward, because that's an important part of Votes for Women, is about coming together for each other, for our sort of democratic personhood, and, you know, how we get that done and be involved and change the country for the better. That's the part that I'm really committed and serious and interested in. So any game that I do is just because I'm a nerd like that, gonna have to do that same thing.
Have you then become more involved in actually playing a lot more modern tabletop games then? I'm guessing
Yes.
that you're kind of getting asked kind of like to come along. You're getting more involved in more events and like occasionally kind of demoing the game and stuff like that, and it'll be, oh, we can play this, and it's like, you can, oh well, let's have a round of Watergate, or let's let's play Twilight Struggle, or have you found that you've become more immersed in kind of playing a lot more modern games because of, I guess, being more involved in the community with Votes for Women?
I think, the events that I've done, it's just like they've been Votes for Women events. And so I'm walking around demoing, I'm giving a speech. I don't have time, I think, to do anything else, but I have been more interested in purchasing titles like Stonewall Uprising. I got, my husband is also a big nerd, if you can imagine, and got Holotype recently, which is about the discovering dinosaurs, and you are a professor, a research assistant, or like a grad student, and you're like going to dig sites. I don't know, like it's just publish or perish kind of a game, worker placement. And so that kind of, and we just got Star Wars, the deck building game. I haven't played that. Right. And so it just like, I think about games more, I talk about games more. And so I've been playing games more, and for like coming out of development and being able to, like, I was just playing a lot of Votes for Women for a while, and it's nice to take a little break. Every once in a while I play again, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is fun. That's cool. But like
it's reminding yourself that I'm actually creating a product that people are meant to be entertained and having downtime with. Because I can imagine you're going to be going, right, I've played this 140 times now, and I just literally want to spend the next half an hour just snapping all of these crosses. One by one. One by one.
But like I was did like a girls' weekend recently and taught a bunch of non-board gaming friends, and it's just sort of important to remember that normies are out there, and that this is a game that like people can grab a hold of, but it will. If you have never played anything before, you gotta I couldn't see them reading the rule book, and it's a great rule book. It's so good, but like there's some videos online, right? Like there are all of these other tools that are helpful. I think we're doing the second printing soon, which is very exciting. And I think there's going to be a player's aid in the box. I think that's just nice.
Yeah. For us non-Americans kind of going, so is that Missouri? Or is that Montana?
So there's also a state code list. Yeah. It turns out Americans are not great at that game either, of knowing what the state codes are. Don't feel like it was not American focused. It was like nerd bias that created that problem. Sorry.
Just looking at that and just going, I have no idea. It's like, it was on the cards. It's like, put 2 campaigners in Michigan or whatever. And I was like going, is that MI? Is that MO? Is that MC? And it's like, well, it's not Texas, so let's work our way back from there. So that's kind of fine.
If there was room on the map, that would be ideal. We're going to do a card that has like a reference sheet for the
completely acceptable, and it's a good. I was hoping you would recall every single copy that you've printed, and then correct your mistake, and then send it back out again, please.
There's one on Board Game Geek you can print yourself and add it to your box.
Okay, I'll let you off for that. There you go. If people have listened along tonight and they want and they're busy,
made it this far,
busy, like throwing tables and stuff like that. If your name's Kevin, stay angry, Kevin. You'll get your turn.
Die mad.
Stay angry. Go and get yourself a snack. You'll feel less angry. And they want to follow you on the internet webs. Where do you exist on the internet webs?
I am on Twitter at Tory Lynn. It's TORYLYNN. Search for Tory Brown or Votes for Women will probably get you there as well. And there's an Instagram page, Votes for Women Game. And if you have played and want to take pictures, I appreciate anything that you share and tag with either of those accounts because it is very nice to see people playing and it's very cheap content to post, which I also really appreciate.
Excellent. We'll make sure that we put all the links in the show notes so that we have got notes to show. If you want to keep an eye on what we're up to, just go to the internet, search for We're Not Wizards, and you shall find us in all the different wonderful electronic places of where dreams and potential nightmares are also made. So we're on Instagram, and we've got our blog, which is we're not wizardstabletop.com. We've got our podcast where you can listen to all the wonderful other episodes that we've done, which is We're Not Wizards.
Do you have a podcast?
Apparently so. And if you like what you've listened to tonight, then please go to your podcast catcher of choice and drop us a rating or a review. Spotify is apparently where it's at. If you are going to Spotify and you decide you want to give us a rating or a review, don't give us 10 stars because it makes us big-headed, but don't give us 1 star because it makes us cry. Give us something in the middle, like a 5, because it's average. And I'm just a little bit average. But the person who's not been average is rather wonderful, rather fantastic. Tory Brown.
Thank you.
So
the crowd goes wild.
or shunning silence like this. There's only 2 more things to do. The first thing to remember is that we are many things, but we're not wizards. Are we wizards, Tory?
Not at all, even a little bit. And would a wizard even tell you if they were?
They'd probably be using some kind of spell. And the second thing is to say goodbye. So it's a goodbye from Tory. Say goodbye, Tory.
Goodbye, Tory.
And it's a goodbye from me. Remember, stay safe, roll 6s, make something awful. And like at the end of things, you usually come full circle. We're coming fort circle. Check out Vote for the Women if you can. It might put a couple of crosses out there, but it's certainly going to tick a lot of boxes. But until the next time, goodbye.
A wizard is never late. Nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.